Hello, Now Playing listeners. This is Arnie, co-host of Now Playing, and you've probably heard by now, but actor Sam Neill passed away this morning at the age of 78. His family says the death is sudden and unexpected, but his health issues have been long known. He had been fighting an angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, which is a rare kind of blood cancer, since 2022. But he announced he was cancer-free in 2023. His family statement said he remained cancer-free when he died, and he was surrounded by family. Now, Sam Neill is an actor of great note who has appeared in over 100 projects across television, film, stage work, but he hasn't been covered much on Now Playing podcast. We did review The Omen 3, The Final Conflict, which was his first starring role in an American production. Then when we did the Tom Clancy films, he is a strong supporting character in The Hunt for Red October, but that's not his film. That is Sean Connery and Alec Baldwin's movie. And then yes, he was in 3 Jurassic Park films, one being, of course, an absolute masterpiece and classic, which when people think of Sam Neill, is going to be the film people think of. And then he was in possibly the silliest of the Jurassic Park films with the dream of a talking velociraptor in Jurassic Park 3, and then came back for the most desperate of the Jurassic Park films, Dominion. And other than cameos that I'm not even sure we mentioned from the 2 Taika Waititi Thor films, Sam Neill being from New Zealand and Taika Waititi also being a New Zealander, Sam Neill really hasn't gotten his due in Now Playing's archives, and I think today is the right day to talk about him. See, last year in our Facebook group, member John Danielson recommended to the entire group Sam Neill's Did I Ever Tell You This?, his memoir, which was first published in 2023. Based on John's review and the fact that I had just finished reading a number of books, this was around the time we were reviewing Gone with the Wind and Clue and Casablanca, and I'd been reading original books, novelizations, and making of books for quite some time, and I was looking for something new to read. And to be honest, I respected Sam Neill's work, but I wasn't such a fan that I thought I'd be reading his memoir. He's an actor I always enjoyed watching in projects good and bad, but I can't think of a time I ever watched something just because Sam Neill was in it. I mean, he had kind of an unusual but successful career. He was in 2 huge blockbusters. No matter what I think of Dominion, it was a blockbuster, billion-dollar film. He had some attempts at blockbusters that failed. He worked in prestige films and prestige television, and also did a lot of independent film work. But when I look at his box office, what are the films he will be remembered for? Outside of Jurassic Park, it would probably be The Hunt for Red October 3 years before, but as I said, not his film. I see that he was in a very successful film I haven't seen, Peter Rabbit and its sequel, where he was old Mr. McGregor. The first one did make $350 million globally. But to me, Sam Neill is just a much more varied character actor. After Jurassic Park, my mind goes to Event Horizon. Now, I know that's a flawed film, but I still think it's pretty great, and I did put it in our underrated movies we recommend book. Out of that, he was nominated, but didn't win a Fangoria Chainsaw Award for Best Actor, and he should have gotten it. He was far better than that year's winner, Al Pacino, in The Devil's Advocate. Neill gave a nuanced and horrific performance, while Pacino basically did what Pacino did, only louder. But outside of my own love for Event Horizon, I remember being surprised when I saw him in The Piano. I saw that based off of Holly Hunter and Jane Campion and the Oscar buzz it was getting, and I didn't know Neill was in that film. And I especially didn't expect him to play a villain. And that film really moved me. Strong performances from the entire cast, including him and the Oscar winners in it, Anna Paquin and Holly Hunter, plus the best screenplay for Jane Campion. It was around the time of The Piano that I also discovered another film of his, a 1989 thriller with him, Nicole Kidman, and Billy Zane called Dead Calm. I also remember that being a flawed film that I enjoyed. And my final go-to with him is still a film that was not fully realized in its first release, at least. It's called Until the End of the World, and I saw that back in the very early 1990s. And Sam Neill talks about that in this book we're going to discuss, how it was completely cut down from its original vision. And that makes sense because my memory of that film is being almost incomprehensible. Now, a 3-hour version has been released, the director's cut. I haven't watched it yet, but I've been so curious if it would be more cohesive and intelligible than the original version I watched. I've been meaning to watch it, and I think I will this weekend in honor of Neill's passing. But for his memoir, now I said in our recent intermission show that I'm not an audiobook guy. I still stand by that. I don't like actors interpreting an author's words for me and thus possibly changing their meaning. But I make an exception when it comes to memoirs like this. When a memoir is read by the author and unabridged, I find it more moving. So hearing Neill tell his stories was going to be more engrossing for me than just reading them. And I can't stress how much I did gain by listening to Neill read his book instead of just reading the words on a page. Neill has a very dry sense of humor, and his delivery, more than his text, made me chuckle several times. His tone of voice was warm and conveyed emotion that sometimes would have been lacking on the page, especially when he's trying to be ironic or wry. That said, I did go and purchase the book on Kindle and found there are a lot of photos in it that I think aid the telling, plus the Kindle version and the later print publication versions are extended and have an addendum that the audiobook and early printings don't have. Ever since I finished the audiobook, I've been intending to do a book review for Now Playing, feeling that Sam Neill is an actor and his memoir is a book that deserves a little bit more spotlight than it had. And this book review is one that I just kept putting off. I kept deprioritizing. Oh, let's do Devil Wears Prada first. Oh, let's do Bonfire of the Vanities first. But I'm going to correct that mistake today. Now, when he starts the book, he describes it as somewhat flung together. Quote, "I write in haste," end quote. And that's because he's writing it while having blood cancer. Diagnosed a year prior to this book's original publication, Sam Neill had his second bout with cancer. It ran in his family. His father died of cancer in 1991. Neill doesn't talk at much length about his first cancer, but describes having a tumor removed. But in 2022, while on a press junket for Dominion, he noticed some swelling. He went to his doctor. He was misdiagnosed as having COVID. The swelling got bigger, and he found out he had the lymphoma. So he took a year off work for treating the illness and used writing this book to sort of keep sane during this year. And you can tell the medical care was very much in his mind. He dedicates the book to Dr. Orly Lavie and all of my friends at St. Vincent's. I wouldn't have started the book without you, and I would certainly never have finished it. And instead of just being a chronological tale of Sam Neill's life, he gets to this blood cancer very early in the book, page 23. This changed my entire view of the memoir because up until that page, I didn't know he'd been sick. I thought I was just picking up yet another actor's memoir. I mean, it feels like every icon from Generation X is writing a memoir right now. I reviewed Robert Englund's here on Now Playing a while ago. I've read and will be reviewing Patrick Stewart's, but it seems every Gen X icon from Molly Ringwald to Will Wheaton to Neil Patrick Harris, hell, even Jenny McCarthy are trying to cash in on Gen X nostalgia by promising behind-the-scenes insights into middle-aged people's childhood favorites. It's what the publishing industry calls an age wave. When famous people are in their 40s to 60s, they're old enough that they have a full career to discuss, and young enough people still care. And most people doing these memoirs their fame probably peaked 15 to 30 years earlier, famous enough to still have stories, but past the point where they could suffer damage by spilling tea on people they used to work with. Still culturally relevant, though, like Tori Amos and Dave Grohl, who wrote memoirs and are still out there touring. COVID really accelerated a lot of memoirs. The Gen X icons are getting to the right age, and they had nothing else to do, and there's a tendency for narcissism among people in entertainment. So COVID led to a writing boom of these, and coming out in 2023, I just thought that's what Sam Neill's book would be too. But that he wrote this book while sick with a life-threatening disease gave the whole thing more import. 23 pages in, it no longer felt like a vanity project. It's more like a reassessment and a celebration of his life. Also, it gave me a thought that this memoir would have something most others don't, which is an arc. Most memoirs are a mishmash of stories told chronologically, but with this one starting with his getting sick, I did think, or at least hope, that it would end with him getting cured. After all, I was listening to this book in 2025 and 2026, so I knew he wasn't dead. But it does make me wonder, who is this memoir for? Because it doesn't follow the conventions of the usual Hollywood celebrity memoir, because he was facing a serious, possibly terminal illness while he wrote it, I'm wondering, was this actually just for Neill to reflect on his life and that it sold and got published was incidental? Or is this a memoir that he was writing for his family so they could have his memories in a permanent form after he's gone? Or is this for his fans and the people reading the book? It does seem like he talks directly to that audience, people like me, the most in the writing. But I'm not sure if he was keeping that in mind when telling his stories, determining what to write next, and where to linger and where to speed up. And I don't think there's a wrong answer among all those options, but it's something I try to think about with every memoir, and with Sam Neill's, I was left a little perplexed, because Sam Neill's memoir is ostensibly about Sam Neill, but he writes, quote, "Most of what I've written has been about other people. And the truth is that I find other people more interesting than I find myself," end quote. And I think that explains almost everything about this memoir, which ostensibly is an accounting of Neill's life, but certainly it is not like the chronological Wikipedia article that gives an accounting of schools, jobs, moves, marriages, and so on. This book came across much more like a diary. Most days were about recording memories of the past, but some days were just about writing about that day and the hell his disease caused and some of the side effects of his treatment that he had to endure. The more I read and the more I ruminated on this, it felt like a book with no plan. And as an exercise to escape the tortures of chemotherapy and other treatments, that's very well what it may have been. But it seemed like whatever memory occurred to him that day became the next chapter, and depending on how well he felt like writing that day, chapters would vary in length from 1 page to 20 pages. And when he didn't have something pressing on his mind, he'd go back to a chronological order about his life, but then he'd just jump and be talking about later roles, lost friends, cars, music, and wine. And this is something that I would think would be fixed by editing. If a famous person is to write their own memoir, and no matter how many people put their own names on a memoir, so many times it's ghost written by somebody else. Here, I have absolutely no question that every word was written by Sam Neill during 2022 and 2023. But then you could hand this to an editor who would rearrange the tales and make them more chronological. Maybe ask him to flesh out a couple of areas. But that is not what was done. And I do feel like, perhaps other than spelling and fact-checking, this is not a heavily edited book. Or maybe this time jumping was important because he may realize there's only so much patience readers have about actors' single-digit years. And truthfully, every time I read a memoir, the opening is the hardest part for me to get through because it is almost always talking about I was born here and my father did this and I went to school here and there was this friend and there was this girl and there was this incident and my mother was usually put upon by thus. And I had to deal with this, and many times we didn't have money and we had to make way with this. It's all important to the person and it's all foundational to who the person became. It's also all somewhat arduous. Whereas with Sam Neill, he would intersperse his childhood with modern topics like later roles or his cancer in between tales of his early years. Sometimes this jumping was charming, and sometimes I found it frustrating. Sometimes the changes were whiplash-inducing because it prevented proper introductions to many of the people in Sam's life who were talked about earlier and then described and explained later. Given why he was writing, given how he was writing, I find this all very easy to forgive. And it fits. This isn't a book about acting. This isn't a book about Hollywood. This is a book about Sam, the person. And yes, he does start with the childhood, how he was born on a kitchen table in Northern Ireland in 1947. His mother was English, his father a New Zealander, and his birth name he hated was Nigel John Dermot Neill. But as a child, his best friend was also named Nigel, and they both hated it, so Sam Neill became Sam, and his friend Nigel Nutt became Bill. And we get the usual memoir stories of his parents and grandparents, childhood mischief, how he came to love dogs, especially greyhounds, and his schooling, and how in 1954, when he was 7, his family moved to New Zealand, his father's homeland, and how Sam Neill thought of himself first and foremost as a New Zealander. He discusses a couple dating stories and his marriage and his children. Neill was married. He divorced in 2017. He has 4 children, but he liked to talk a lot about his passions, and there are 3 of them that take up quite a lot of ink in the book. First and earliest is music. He talks about as a child loving the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, Jimi Hendrix, and so on. And later on in the book, his love of music continued, and he sounds giddy as a child talking about getting to meet Bruce Springsteen, Tom Jones, Herbie Hancock, and Sting. And he actually seemed a little bit more excited about Herbie Hancock. His second passion seems to be cars. He kept a collection of toy cars that he had since his childhood. He said that New Zealanders were very attached to their cars in the 1950s. And section after section, he takes us through his car ownership, starting with in the 50s, he got a 1920s Lincoln sedan as a college student. And when he made money as an actor in 1983, the first thing he bought was his dream car, a black Porsche 911 SC. But he then got embarrassed by owning it. He described himself as, quote, a prick in a Porsche, end quote. And after being called out on it, he traded it in for his words, very dull BMW 5. Neill's third passion seems to be wine. This one came up rather late in the book, as I think it came up rather late in his life. Neill started a winery called Two Paddocks that made Pinot Noir. Now, Neill wasn't really a wine person until introduced to it in the 1980s while he was in his 30s. He was given a proper wine education by Lolita star James Mason. Now, Mason was 40 years older than Neill, but he kind of became Neill's mentor in the late 70s and on. They'd eventually be in the same movie together, Ivanhoe, in the early 80s, but long before that, Mason was guiding Neill's career. It was even Mason who suggested Neill work on his first American film, The Omen 3. And yes, James Mason introduced Neill to good wine, which became his passion. And when he found out you could grow wine grapes in the Otago region of New Zealand, where Neill was living, well, his friend was buying some land for vineyards and needed an investor, and Sam Neill became the founder of his own vineyards. Now, as someone who never got a taste for wine, a lot of this was not only lost on me, but a little bit arduous. I think a wine connoisseur will love it, and the rest of us are just kind of happy he had found his greatest passion, or maybe his second greatest passion. I think his first passion is his friends. Again, the book is often stories about people in his life and not himself. He wrote, quote, "So many of the stories in this book are about people who enriched my life immeasurably, or occasionally not. If I've made a film that turns out to be good, that's a good result. If I've made a film that's good and made a couple of friends, that's a great result. If I've made a film that's no good, but I made a friend, that's still another great result. It's at a time like now that the importance of other people is thrown into even sharper relief. You realize who your friends are. You know where the love is. My children are extraordinary, and I now have 8 grandchildren. I am immensely proud of them all. My girls were just here with family, so affectionate and supportive, so easy to be with, so funny. I love the ease that comes when you're all adults, the shorthand you have, the gentle teasing that we all do that makes us comfortable and really known." I think that tells you Neill's thesis for this book. It's not about the jobs, it's about the people. But, of course, most people, myself included, rarely read memoirs about people we don't know. Most people are here for stories about his acting career and maybe his reflection or assessments of his own achievements. At the beginning of the book, any acting stories are interstitial in between childhood tales and medical care. And they hop around. He'll mention the Caruso TV series, a movie named Skin, the Robert Redford film The Horse Whisperer, and others. And when he's mentioning these films, he's telling of mostly positive experiences with directors, with his co-stars, name dropping every once in a while, but mostly describing how his career was full of lucky breaks and somebody who kind of fell upward. Also, every actor's memoir includes the story of when they were bitten by the acting bug and what their early roles were, and I think that's almost forced upon them. I think the most common question an actor gets from reporters to aspiring actors to daydreamers alike is, how did you get into acting? Everybody's hoping for that shortcut, that secret formula, that bit of knowledge that will open all the doors. So every actor includes their personal history of that. And with Sam Neill, he wasn't necessarily seeking out acting. He was a teenager studying business and law at an all-boys school, and one of the only ways to interact with girls was through the productions that the school was doing. But he says he did think he was pretty good at it. But after what we would call high school, he wasn't sure what to do. And in college, he started acting again. And that's when, doing theater, he really got the idea of being an actor. And he did plays while getting a Bachelor's of Arts degree. And he spent a few years doing stage productions across New Zealand with touring companies. And he seemed to remember all of those well. He doesn't bog the book down with stories from back then too often, but he does have anecdotes about old friends and youthful views as he became more traveled. What's interesting is the left turn it takes. He actually quit acting in 1972 thinking it was not a way to make a living, and he got a job at the post office. That didn't last, and he ended up at the New Zealand National Film Unit, which was a government agency working on film. And he spent a couple of years there as a sound and video editor for documentaries and did a little bit of directing. And on the side, he did a couple of plays. But then he was asked to play a priest in a short film called Ashes. And from that, director Roger Donaldson contacted Neill to be the lead in a film called Sleeping Dogs. That came out in 1977 when Neill was 30. And Neill tells some stories from that set. But then he went back to the National Film Unit thinking his acting life was over. He really hated his performance in Sleeping Dogs, but it got decent reviews and went to some film festivals. And he was contacted while doing press in Australia to try out for another film called My Brilliant Career. This is when he got an agent, Bill Shanahan, who became a big force in Neill's life until his death in 1992. I'm not going to recount Neill's stories or his filmography that he does in the book, but after My Brilliant Career, he didn't have a brilliant career. He did what was called one of the worst Australian films ever, called The Journalist. And then he went and did an Australian soap opera that he hated. He was actually taking over a character played by Mel Gibson before him. And then he ended up working with Gibson in 1981 on a film called Attack Force Z. But he continues stories from his films, including Until the End of the World and Event Horizon. And of course, people would demand a refund if he didn't talk about Jurassic Park. And I found this part strangely endearing, because he wasn't secure as an actor about doing the film. He was no action hero, and he and the others on the film felt kind of put down because Universal kept saying in press releases that they were out to prove they and Spielberg, quote, could make huge blockbusters without movie stars, end quote. Not only did that undermine the actor's confidence, but in Sam's words, it overlooked Laura Dern and Jeff Goldblum's acting careers. It also didn't help that this whole movie without stars only came to be after Harrison Ford refused to play the role of Alan Grant that Neill would eventually play. But he talks about the famous hurricane that destroyed all the sets. It's a well-told tale, caused $1 billion of damage in Hawaii. And he also talks fondly about Jurassic World Dominion and the reunion he had with Jeff Goldblum and Laura Dern. And he and Laura Dern were great friends at the end here, where he's talking about her contacting him and reassuring him through his treatments. I'm going to restate this, though. As I'm going through this, I do wish the book were a bit more polished and chronological. Every time I think it's going to take up a narrative and tell of his growing acting career in the 80s, it jumps to the 90s and 2000s before jumping back. That doesn't make the book incomprehensible, but it does require a lot more effort on the part of the reader to piece together Neill's life story. It's kind of like Pulp Fiction, where the narrative is anything but chronological. But what this book isn't is a bridge-burning, say what I really think, screw Hollywood tell-all. Neill never came across like a man angry about his condition or holding any grudges about his past. There wasn't any score-settling gossip fest. The closest it came was discussing an on-set row between Meryl Streep and Charles Dance on the 1985 film Plenty, and picturing those two in an argument did make me laugh. And he tells the reader outright that his romances will stay private. And when he discusses other famous people, they're usually just amusing anecdotes, sometimes with sad endings. And I could tell Neill was having a preoccupation with death. He's constantly thinking of lost friends and lost coworkers. One he brings up is Robin Williams, who he worked with on Bicentennial Man, discussing Williams' problems on that set with some of the prosthetics, but also making the observation so many have made that Robin Williams was a sad clown who was always on when out among the people and very quiet when not in public. But if you want to hear of Sam Neill's friendship with Meryl Streep or how many people's performances awed him while they worked together, plenty of that is in this book. And whoever he mentions is there because of what they meant to Neill, not because they're famous. Most of the people discussed are those important to him, not actors or directors or in the biz. And what little name dropping he does isn't of actors usually, but of musicians. Again, his love of music makes this feel less like, can you believe I hung out with Sting? Aren't I cool? But more like meeting Sting was a youthful dream come true. And what I took away from this book most was not learning about his career, it was learning about him. He was self-deprecating, writing lines like, quote, "Don't take this too seriously. I am, after all, shallow as a puddle." And again, while on the precipice of death in 2022, he never sounded bitter, angry, or self-pitying. And that was my biggest admiration for him, was that he was simply accepting death. He didn't fear it. He would miss his children and grandchildren, but had no ego about survival. But he also understood acting. Despite kind of falling into it, he took his craft seriously, but perhaps because of literally writing this while in a hospital, he never seemed to confuse it with being a truly important profession. He knew that doctors saves lives, he entertains, and he knows that difference. But I was so happy when I got to the end of the book because despite the timeline jumping, the through line was his cancer and his treatment. And much like how he announced his blood cancer a few pages into the book, with a few pages left to go, he announces the news he was in full metabolic remission. The tumors were gone. And as a reader, that was such a sigh of relief because he started writing believing he was documenting the last days of his life, and he finished the book with a high viewpoint towards the rest of it. And again, when I got the Kindle version of the book, it has an addendum further than the audiobook, the extra passages at the end. And the primary one was written in 2024. And he says it's been 18 months since he finished writing the book. He felt great and had gone back to acting, doing TV series like The 12 and Apples Never Fall. But as he writes, his focus is again on his friends and family. And I think he was most proud to write of his newest granddaughter. His final paragraphs in this extended material read, quote, "The last 2 years, the experience of being very ill and then going into remission have given me all sorts of new perspectives. What is important and what not. Who cares for you and who couldn't care less. The last 2 years have taught me that, at the end of the day, I don't really matter. Not really. I am a speck on a tiny rock in a galaxy among billions of galaxies. But how grateful I am to have been that speck, if only for a tiny fleck of time in a limitless eternity." End quote. How happy and serene Neill seemed in 2023 and 2024, and how sad that makes me as a fan in 2026. And so, having finished the book and reflecting on it with his passing, I'll summarize it this way. I respected Sam Neill far more at the end of the book than when I began, and I started with a good deal of respect for his profession. The book didn't make me impressed with Sam Neill the celebrity, but I was impressed by Sam Neill, the man who values his friends, his family, and his hobbies, even if I don't share his passions for cars and wine. And if you want a making of Jurassic Park, there's a lot of featurettes, documentaries, and books about that. This book isn't one of them. And if you want to tell all about debauchery and Hollywood excess, there's not much of that either. This is a book about a good man who happened to become an actor, and it's a book about a strong man facing long odds on survival. He overcame those odds and, judging by that 2024 addendum, never took those for granted. I think this memoir is a wonderful monument to a life well lived of an actor that millions of people love for one movie and then go, "Hey, it's that guy," in a lot else. I think Sam did write this book first for himself, but in doing so, he gave us a very personal insight into who he really is. I think that is, he tried to be a good man who left this world with a little more than he took from it. If you, like me, are mourning Sam Neill today, I can say give this book a read. I think he'd be very glad if you did. And now to end this podcast, I'm going to do so with a moment of silence for Sam Neill.
The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of Venganza Media Incorporated. This has been a Venganza Media production. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved.